Question number 7, the Right Honourable Winston Peters. Order. Sorry. Order. Order. There's quite a lot of interjection occurring. I'm going to invite the member to start his question again.
This question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he stand by all his statements?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Yes.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
When he said that Mr Sherwin was independent, was he aware of his Westpac Banking Corporation Australian-owned bank settlement of $2.2 billion to IRD, which they had attempted to evade in terms of taxation?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I wouldn't want to agree with the member's characterisation, but yes, I'm aware he worked on the issue.
You were? Oh, great. Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston.
When he made the appointment about his expertise, was he aware of the Penny and Hooper case where the Court of Appeal and Supreme Court dismissed Mr Sherwin's evidence as being inappropriate from an expert witness?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I wasn't aware of that particular point, but I would say this, that John Sherwin has been highly respected across the tax industry in New Zealand. He's been chairman of PwC. He is someone that was given an award in either the Queen's birthday or New Year's honours. And frankly, actually, when it comes to financial expertise and knowing what he's talking about, he runs rings around that member.
Point of order. Mr Speaker, my question was about a case in 2010. Either he was aware or not aware, and after that he should have been stopped.
Order. And the member did, the Prime Minister immediately said he was not aware of that particular case.
Point of order.
Point of order.
When he said he wasn't aware, why wasn't he then stopped?
Order. Order. It's a point of order. I wish to hear it in silence. Right on.
Speaker, when the Prime Minister said he wasn't aware, why then wasn't he stopped from rambling on about something he wasn't asked about?
The member makes... Order. The member makes a reasonable point, as I've mentioned many times in this House. I'll determine when I think an answer's gone on for too long. Further supplementary?
When he made the statement
supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
When the Prime Minister made the statement about the expertise of Mr Sherwin, was he aware of how his so-called expertise on form over substance on the wine box allegations conflicted with the Privy Council, the Court of Appeal and the full High Court of New Zealand?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'm aware of John Sherwin's complete integrity. That's not something I'm sure of when it comes to every member.
Oh, you can take that. Next question.
Order.
Have you been looking in the mirror?
Order.
Point of
order.
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 Point of order.
Point of order.
Mr Speaker, there are reasonably clear rules and have in the past been enforced reasonably clear rules about questioning the integrity of other members in the House, which stops members from doing so for very good reasons.
Yeah, and on that occasion it wasn't addressed at any particular member that I took it. Further. Point of order. Point of order. Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, in which case it was directed at all members, in which case I take offence.
On the basis that Chris Hipkins is offended, I'm going to ask the Prime Minister to stand and withdraw the last part of that answer.
Sorry, Chris.
Order. Question. Order. 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 The Right Honourable Prime Minister will now stand and withdraw it correctly without any addition.
I withdraw.
Supplementary question. Order. Order. And when I'm on my feet, the Honourable Amy Adams equally. The member should be quiet. David Seymour, supplementary question.
In what century did the wine box inquiry take place?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
One so far back I can hardly remember it.
Very sad, eh?
Order. Order. Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Why did he tell the Paul Henry show yesterday that he was taking a paper to Cabinet that morning proposing the appointment of an international tax expert?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Because I did.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary. Order. Order. Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
So what happened to the international tax expert? Did he turn you down?
Well, he didn't turn me down, but the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the member can come into the House and abuse and bag Mr Shan if he wants, but Mr Shan has a glittering career. I'll get him to reflect on his own.
Supplementary question? No, point of order, Speaker.
Order.
Point of order.
Order.
Mr Speaker, why is the Prime Minister allowed...
Point of order, the Right Honourable.
Mr Speaker, why is the Prime Minister allowed to lace up the end of every inferior answer with an epithet or insult?
I invite the member to go back and equally look at his question, where he finished his question by saying, did he turn you down? Supplementary question.
What insult was that?
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston.
Is this highly independent John Shan the same John Shan at Nationals Caucus Party held at Premier House hosted by the Prime Minister?
If there's any ministerial responsibility, the Prime Minister.
Probably, and so with the Parliamentary Press Gallery and many other people. People love come to a National Party function. It's a lot of fun. You used to be the cheerleader amongst them, Winston.
Point of order, Speaker.
Order.
Point of order, Speaker.
Order. I'm just waiting for silence from my left.
Speaker,
Point of order, the Right Honourable Winston.
why is the Prime Minister allowed to get away with an end of an answer like that over and over again?
I suspect, if I was applying the rules very strictly, the question was out of order and it asked an issue for which there's no Prime Ministerial responsibility. It's a party matter. Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
Why is it that you allow a question, presumably because it's in order, and yet when challenged as to allowing out-of-order replies, always flick the complaint away by saying I shouldn't have allowed the question?
I didn't... Order. I'm happy to try and help the member. I didn't say I shouldn't have asked the question. I said the question strictly wasn't in line with standing orders. Now, I can start, if the members want me to apply it very, very rigorously. I suspect it would not be to the advantage of the opposition, and I suspect after a relatively short period of time, members would wish that I didn't do that. But in that particular case, given the question the way it was asked and the answer the way it was given, I was satisfied that it was within the bounds of the rules.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Okay, can I just, before I take any further points of order, if it's in any way relitigating the decision I've made and the answer that I've given,
no, it's
fresh
not.
Point of order.
It's a fresh point of order,
Fresh
sir.
point of order, the Honourable David.
How was the question out of order?
Well, I thought
Because
again,
it was about the
order.
Prime Minister.
I'll try and explain it. The issue was about the attendance at a National Party function. Well, as I heard it, it was, and that's the... Question. Order. Order. My patience is running extremely thin with the Dr. Megan Woods. If she continues to interject, particularly when I'm standing on my feet, she leaves me no choice but to ask her to leave. Further supplementary? Supplementary question. Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Can he confirm that Mr Sherwin was a long-standing partner and chairman of PricewaterhouseCoopers New Zealand, the same accounting firm that was directly implicated in the 2014 LuxLeaks scandal?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Answer to the first part of the question, yes, and the answer to the second part of the question, no, I don't know what the member's talking about.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question.
This one's for table.
Right Honourable Winston.
Is he aware of the connection between PricewaterhouseCoopers and Cayman Islands organisations and companies and trusts, and one Koran Trust Company, Cayman Limited? Is he aware of that?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, no.
Supplementary question. Point of order.
Or point of order. Right Honourable
Mr
Winston
Speaker,
Peters.
I seek to table relevant documents that relate to that last question of the Prime Minister, where he appears blissfully unaware of what's going on.
Just explain the documents.
Well, you won't find them around.
Order, just explain. No. Order.
This is a corporate record and register not available for public inspection, which I seek to table.
Leave a sort to table that particular corporate record. Is there any objection? Is there any objection? There appears to be no objection. The member can table it. Question number 8, Dr.